Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Last week, Gallup released the results of a new poll that finds a significant upsurge in religiosity amongst young men. There remains a lot of work to be done for society to regain sanity and particularly God's order in the public sphere, but this is encouraging news. If we want to create strong, faith-filled fathers who teach Catholic and pro-life beliefs and values to their children, we must first create strong and faith-filled young men. Michael New joins us. Michael is an assistant professor of the practice at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. He's also a senior associate scholar at the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Always glad to reconnect with you, especially for news this crucial. Can you please share with us the overarching view of the Gallup poll and what it revealed?
Sure. Gallup does polls on kind of religiosity periodically, and they released a new poll early this month, and the results are interesting. They found that 42% of men between the age of 18 to 29 say that religion is very important in their lives. And what's interesting is it has a 14 percentage point gain from just 2 years ago. So the percentage of men who say that, young men who say that religion is very important increased by 14 percentage points in just a 2-year time span. So that's a very encouraging result. Another thing that's also interesting is that among a wide range of kind of age demographics, usually women report being more religious than men. But a number of survey questions indicate that this generation of young people, men are actually more religious than women. That's true among men who say that religion is important in their life. It's true of men who say they attend a worship service at least monthly. It's true among men who just say they identify with a certain faith tradition. So these are interesting results.
Share with us about the age demographic where the surge in religiosity is showing.
Right. So it's basically we see this big surge again amongst young men, men between the ages of 18 to 29. So I think that's certainly encouraging. A lot of people think that just secularization is just kind of inevitable. The young people have socially liberal views about a range of issues and just are not interested in faith. But that's not the case. We see from these results that a lot of young men are interested in faith. We see that in a lot of media reports that a lot of people who cover religion for even the mainstream media see just more young men showing up at church services. As many of your listeners know, we had a lot of converts to the Catholic faith around Easter. The many Newman centers reported big increases in number of Catholic converts. So this generation, I think, is more interested in religion than people give them credit for.
Historically, as surveys like this have been done, especially in recent history, have we seen a similar pattern, or has it always leaned more towards women in terms of religiosity?
Generally, it's always leaned more toward women, But this generation of young people just seems kind of unique. Several things. They had their academic career disrupted by the pandemic. I think they crave authenticity. They crave community. I also think this is a generation of young men that's had to put up with a lot of woke ideology, and I think there's a pushback against that. Church groups are probably one of the few places where young men are actually encouraged to seek out leadership positions. I think that's appealing in many ways. So I think this generation of young people, young men, has just dealt with some issues that previous generations have not dealt with, and I think that's resulting in more interest in Christianity and Catholicism.
For those surveyed, and according to the results, are these young men identifying as generally spiritual, or are they finding expressions in structured religious expression?
It's hard to say. I mean, the poll isn't as nuanced as we would like. It does say that, a high percent, 42% say religion is, very important in their lives. It also does show that a high percentage do identify with a certain faith tradition. They just don't say they're spiritual. They do pick a certain faith tradition, whether it's Catholic, Baptist, Lutheran. So the fact they're selecting a faith tradition and saying, yes, this is me, yes, I identify this way, I think they want structure. I don't think they're just saying they're spiritual or have some vague belief in a higher power. If they're picking out a specific faith tradition, they're saying they want some structure.
This this is a recent surge, and I'm grateful for it. What has the lack of this kind of a structured belief among young men done to society?
I think it's had some negative effects in certain ways. I think that a lot of generations of young men I think have been just disengaged. That their workforce participation is lower among some cohorts of young men than others. That you just see them disengaged from community. They're less likely to be in stable relationships. They're kind of, if they do date or they do engage with the opposite sex, it's a hookup scene where they're not making commitment. So I think that the structure is certainly helpful. That when you're in a church of any kind, certain things are expected of you. You're going to probably be expected to show up at work consistently. If you have a relationship, you're going to be expected to be committed to that person. It's not going to be a hookup or a fly-by-night thing. So structure, I think, is good for everybody, especially young men.
Is there a kind of political worldview that's influencing this?
It's kind of hard to say, whether that's the case or not. That we do see a larger increase in church attendance among Republican young men. It's hard to say whether kind of conservative views are driving church attendance or whether consistent church attendance is kind of resulting in more conservative views on things, or maybe a bit of both. But we do see kind of a big gain among Republican young men. Long term, we've seen a consistent decline in church attendance amongst Democratic young men. But we do see kind of recent increases amongst Republican young men, whether that's because, again, they're conservative and find their values reinforced at church, or whether churches are just kind of giving them conservative social values. I'm not quite sure which is which.
We definitely have seen different polls that are suggesting, especially within the Catholic sphere, that younger ministers, younger priests that are coming up have a more decidedly socially conservative worldview, and that seems to be one of the impacting factors for the rise in young people being drawn to structured religion. Could you please comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing we've seen from a lot of surveys of clergy is that most, young clergy typically have fairly sort of conservative views, about theology and about social issues, and I think that certainly is appealing to a lot of young people. Some people think we have to water down the faith, and I think that's totally incorrect. I think people, want the truth. They want to hear strong teachings. They want to have high standards. And I think that, we have a generation of seminarians who kind of are coming into the church who really are kind of, in some respects, realize the church is countercultural, but realize we have something valuable to add as far as truth and good teachings, strong teachings. I think that is attracting a lot of young men.
We saw quite a surge of a lot of social and religious narratives of a particular sort, especially since the 60s. How's that impacted the generation before these young men?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think that, there was a generation of seminarians who kind of came in for different reasons. They kind of saw themselves in some respects, and I don't like to, stereotype people, but it's more of like social workers. They were there to kind of help people, not necessarily, preach the truth. I think there was also a generation of seminarians who came in thinking the church was going to actually change its teachings on contraception. That didn't happen, or at least artificial contraception. So I think you had a group of seminarians that, were well-intentioned. I'm not saying these people, joined, went to seminary for bad reasons, but they went for different reasons. Nowadays, I think you get a group of seminarians who really are interested in church teachings, kind of proclaiming the truth, proclaiming the gospel, are not willing to hide from tough teachings, but willing to, explain them to people. And I think that that's having a positive influence.
You commented on this earlier, but I'd like to ask you to comment on the converse of it. As we're seeing a rise in those who identify as socially conservative or Republican in religious attendance, those who identify as Democrat, we're out of time. I just wanted to have your thoughts. We can pick this up on the other side of the break, Michael. My guest is Michael New. He's a professor of the practice at the Bush School of Law in the Catholic University of America. We're talking about the recent Gallup poll that proves there's a surge amongst young men 18 to 29 in terms of religiosity and structured religious practice, which is heartening, and it presents a tremendous opportunity for us. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Dr. Michael New, professor of the practice at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Last week, Gallup released the results of a new poll that finds a significant upsurge in religiosity amongst young men, and so we're exploring that a little deeper. We were talking about this before the break, Michael. You had shared with us that the surveys also revealed that a lot of the upsurge tends to be among those who identify as Republican and definitely socially conservative. But on the flip side of the political narrative, we're not seeing the same increase in religious attendance among young Democrats. Why is that? Just your thoughts on the matter.
It's hard to say. I mean, one thing that the poll did show is that between, say, 2022 and 2025, amongst young Republican men, there's a 7 percentage point increase among those who attend a worship service at least monthly. It went from 45% to 52%. You saw a slight increase amongst Democratic men, not nearly as big. One thing that was interesting is you see long-term declines in Democrats, both Democratic young men and Democratic young women in their church attendance. Since 2000, the percentage of Democratic men who attend church services at least monthly fell by 14 percentage points. Since 2000, the percentage of Democratic women who attend church services fell by 19 points. I think that, frankly, the Democratic Party has just become, a lot more secular, and frankly, in many cases, is a lot more hostile to organized religion. I think these days, at one point, people kind of just joined the political party that their family was a part of. Now I think people join a party that's kind of consistent with their ideological beliefs, and I think that people of faith, for I think good reason, often just don't feel welcome in the Democratic Party. I mean, this is a party that aggressively supports same-sex marriage, supports taxpayer funding for abortion, doesn't always seem sympathetic to the conscience rights of religious people. So again, people coming of age just look at the two parties, and if they're of faith, they see a Democratic Party that just seems, in many cases, very hostile towards those of faith.
This past Easter, we saw a tremendous amount of conversions, record numbers in many dioceses across the country. Many of the converts coming in were themselves male. And because of this surge, can you speak to why so many of them seem drawn to the Catholic faith?
I think they want that structure. I think they want that authenticity. I also think that the Catholic faith has done some, many dioceses have done some smart things in recent years. We've seen a bigger investment in young adult programming. I think that the Catholic Church, like other faith traditions, was a little bit slow to realize that many people don't get married right after college, but many dioceses do have, people doing young adult ministry full time, and I think that gives them a network for a lot of young people to plug into. One thing I'm heartened by is that lots of Knights of Columbus chapters have started on college campuses. We did not have that when I was a college student. I think that builds kind of a built-in network, a built-in community, a way you can go get involved with the church and get involved with volunteer projects, as a young man. So I think there are different things that have, the teachings and the activities, and I think have just combined have had a strong impact and have interested a lot of young men in the faith.
During the pandemic, a lot of families left the practice of the faith, and many of them have not returned. Did that have any impact on these young men and the way they're seeking truth and structure now?
I don't have really good data on that, but it wouldn't surprise me. The pandemic was probably more disruptive for young people than for people who are my age. That when part of your, half your high school career is disrupted by a pandemic, that has an impact. And I think that, it may have, hindered friendships in certain ways, and a lot of young people, especially when they're starting out, they want community, and churches can provide that. In fact, they're a great source of that for people. So if people felt that their kind of lives are undermined by a pandemic and they want that community, the Catholic Church is waiting for them.
You've already commented on this part, but the push for secular liberalism and the secular religiosity, know God and do what you want, has that become an inadvertent preacher of the gospel, compelling people to seek structure in the church?
I think so. I think that the whole idea of do what you want as long as it makes you happy just doesn't actually make people happy. There's a difference between doing something that's pleasant and being happy. And, riding a roller coaster might be pleasant. It probably does not make you happy. And I think kind of, real happiness comes from structure, comes from community, comes from some self-sacrifice. All that can be found in the church. So people who just come of age and amuse themselves with social media and video games, I think they realize they're not actually happy. They may be entertained, but they're not happy. Happiness, I think, comes from real faith and comes from authenticity, and the church provides that.
Since especially the 60s, we've seen a social narrative push of hedonism, anti-Christian sentiment, and definitely with overt feminism, the emasculation of men in the public sphere. In all of this, we've seen a crisis of fatherhood. Can you comment on that and how that's impacting the search of these young men?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, frankly, for a variety of reasons, it's been just, less is expected of young men. And when less is expected, people kind of fall to those lower expectations oftentimes. Mm-hmm. At one point before, contraception became prevalent, if you were a young man and you got a woman pregnant, you married her. If you didn't marry that woman, you were allowed. Nobody thought nobody would deal with you. With contraception and other things, men could walk away from women they impregnated. So when you kind of set low standards for people avoid meeting those low standards. And I think in a variety of ways, the fact that men are often put down and marginalized, men kind of respond to that. But nowadays, the church asks a lot of men. They ask them to lead. They ask them to be responsible. And leadership responsibility, I think, is naturally attractive to a lot of men. So I think that is having an impact.
We've had generations of fathers who have either been absent or simply non-existent, frankly, because we've had an entire generation where women, or at least a lot of people within the generation, where women couldn't even identify who the father of the child was. And that's created severe social impacts. A lot of what it needs to happen now is a redefinition of the role of father in society. Can you please speak to that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that, again, more needs to be asked of men. When you don't expect much of anybody, they tend to offer little in return. But when you set high expectations for people, they often live up to those expectations. And I think that we've gone through a culture where men and fatherhood are kind of downplayed and denigrated. And when you look at mainstream TV, very often the male role model in the family is someone who is marginalized and put down. It's a Homer Simpson. It's an Al Bundy. It's someone that people don't think well of, and that's not necessarily what people should aspire to. I mean, we should have situations where the male role model, the father is a role model who people look up to, who does the right thing even when it's tough to do, not somebody who's lazy or a slob or disrespectful. So, and I think that there's just some pushback against that. I think that, again, we are starting to expect more of our boys, our men, and again, when you expect more out of people, they often live up to that.
I'm glad that you brought up the media narrative, because another thing that virtually all of our listeners are aware of is that the centrality of... So the strong father role model has been co-opted by, like you mentioned, the Homer Simpsons and the Al Bundys. But the other thing, too, is the centrality of a faith perspective and identity in that father figure. That's also lost in the media narrative. Just share with us your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even, I was just, even in a lot of, popular television shows, you really just very rarely do you see people going to church, or if they do go to church, it's for usually a funeral. You don't see, church in the central of people's lives, in most, mainstream TV shows. And, it's been that way for a long time. I don't know if that's changing as such, but I think it is an important trend that, very rarely do you see somebody in a situation comedy or a drama go to a church, unless, again, it's for like a funeral or a special occasion. And it's certainly, it's at best, a side dish. It certainly isn't, central to the plot or the theme of the show.
Is it likely that this resurgence of religiosity in young men is happening because many of these young men realize what they didn't get and what they didn't have, and so they want to seek it for themselves and hopefully to be able to give that to their sons in the next generation?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, a lot of these men came of age when church was a side dish or maybe just non-existent, and I think they realize that they're missing something, and then, when they get married and have kids, they really want a family that's faith-filled and really where church is central to their life and not just some kind of a side dish or optional activity. I think that they realize that they may have missed something that they really ought to have had, and want to make sure that's available for their kids.
Yeah, and that's going to be heartening. We're probably not going to see the grander effects for yet another generation, but like you've mentioned and like we've been talking about, there's a tremendous amount of hope, and so with this surge comes an opportunity. How can we respond? What can we do? How can the church respond to steward this well?
I think that the church is doing a good job, but could always do more. It really needs to, really reach out to, young men. That they have to realize that, a lot of people, a lot of young men, don't get married right away. That they may be single for a little bit of a long time, but that the church needs them, and that they're needed to, run committees and join the Knights of Columbus, and if there's not a young adult group in their parish, set one up. That they should make clear that young men aren't spectators. They're an important part of the church. I always tell young pro-lifers, you're not the future leadership of the movement. You are the movement. You are leading right now. And I think the Catholic Church needs to tell young men the same thing, that your skills, talent, time are needed right away. Whatever God feels you to do, whether it's running a Right to Life group or working on young adult ministry or being an officer in Knights of Columbus, your skills are needed right now to build the church.
And, of course, pray and for all of us, try to be witnesses and to create avenues for these young men to rise up. Michael, thank you very much for your time. This is such a heartening bit of news, but we have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
My guest has been Michael New, professor at Catholic University of America. We've been talking about the Gallup poll that's indicated there's a rise in religiosity and religious seriousness amongst young men. Let's steward that well in the church. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.